Have you ever experienced that moment when your entire world shifts on its axis? When a single sentence spoken by a stranger completely dismantles everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you? I'm talking about that earth-shattering instant when reality crashes through the carefully constructed walls of lies, and you're left standing there, watching the faces of those you love transform from familiar to completely unrecognizable. That's exactly what happened to me in a courtroom on a Tuesday afternoon that I will never ever forget. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what matters is what I witnessed, what I endured, and how a judge's simple question exposed a truth so devastating that it would reshape my entire understanding of my family, my childhood, and my very identity. I was 23 years old, sitting in that sterile courtroom with its harsh fluorescent lights and uncomfortable wooden benches, my palms sweating, my heart racing, completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. The air smelled like old paper and furniture polish, and I remember thinking how strange it was that such life-altering moments could happen in such ordinary, mundane places. I had always believed I knew my family inside and out, that we were close, that we shared everything, that the bond between us was unbreakable and built on a foundation of honesty and trust. How naive I was. How beautifully, tragically naive. The question the judge asked wasn't even directed at me initially. It was a simple inquiry. A standard procedural question that probably gets asked in courtrooms across the country every single day. But the way my mother's face drained of all color, the way my father's hands started trembling, the way my sister's eyes went wide with something that looked like pure terror, I knew in that instant that I had been living in a carefully orchestrated illusion for my entire life. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you need to understand the full story. You need to walk with me through every painful step of this journey, to truly grasp the magnitude of what that single question revealed. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a time when I still believed in the fairy tale version of my family, when I thought I was lucky to be part of something so seemingly perfect and whole. Growing up, I was the middle child in what everyone described as the ideal American family. My father was a successful architect. My mother was a beloved elementary school teacher. My older brother was the golden child who excelled at everything he touched, and my younger sister was the baby everyone adored. We lived in a beautiful colonial house with a white picket fence. Literally, I know how cliché that sounds, but it was true. The house sat on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's names, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where summer meant barbecues and block parties and the sound of laughter floating through open windows. From the outside, we were perfect. We were the family that others envied, the one that neighbors pointed to as an example of what family should be. My parents never fought, at least not in front of us. They held hands at church. They kissed each other goodbye every morning. They celebrated every anniversary with elaborate dinners and thoughtful gifts. My siblings and I got along well enough. The usual childhood squabbles, but nothing serious, nothing that ever made me question the strength of our bonds. We had family game nights every Friday. We took vacations together every summer. We gathered around the dinner table every evening without fail, sharing stories about our days, laughing at my father's terrible jokes, listening to my mother's wisdom about life and love and everything in between. I remember feeling so grateful, so blessed to be part of this unit, this team, that seemed to navigate life with such grace and unity. My friends would come over and comment on how lucky I was, how they wished their families were like mine, and I would smile and nod, secretly agreeing, secretly feeling like I had won some kind of cosmic lottery. But here's what I didn't understand then. What I couldn't possibly have comprehended with my young, innocent mind. Perfection is always an illusion, and the more perfect something appears on the surface, the darker the secrets that lurk beneath. The cracks were there all along, tiny fissures in the foundation that I was too trusting or too naive or too comfortable to notice, and by the time I finally saw them for what they were, the entire structure was already crumbling. The first time I felt something was genuinely off, really truly wrong in a way that made my stomach turn, I was about 16 years old. It was during one of those ordinary evenings that should have been completely unremarkable but somehow wasn't. We were sitting at dinner. My mother had made her famous pot roast. The dining room was filled with that warm, savory smell that usually made everything feel safe and homey, and we were going through our usual routine of sharing about our days. My older brother Marcus was talking about his college applications. My sister Emma was complaining about her math homework, and I was half listening, picking at my food, when I mentioned something I had overheard at school. It was nothing important, just some gossip about a teacher who had apparently been fired for reasons no one quite understood, and I made a casual comment about how strange it was that adults sometimes did things that didn't make sense, that sometimes people weren't who they appeared to be. The moment those words left my mouth, the atmosphere in the room shifted so dramatically that it felt like someone had sucked all the oxygen out. My father's fork clattered against his plate, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden silence. My mother's face went completely still, frozen in this weird half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus stared at his food with an intensity that seemed excessive, and Emma, who was only 12 at the time, looked around the table with confusion written all over her face. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity, like I had somehow broken an unspoken rule that I didn't even know existed. Then my father cleared his throat, forced a laugh, and said something about how I was getting too philosophical, and my mother quickly changed the subject to weekend plans, and everyone seemed to relax again. But I didn't relax, I couldn't, because I had felt something dark and unnamed slither through that dining room, something that made me realize there were things happening in my family that I didn't understand, conversations happening in rooms I wasn't allowed to enter, secrets being kept in a house that I had always believed was built on transparency and truth. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into an awkward moment, that families had weird dynamics sometimes and it didn't mean anything sinister. I pushed the feeling down, buried it deep, but it never completely went away. It just sat there in my chest like a cold stone waiting. After that dinner, I started noticing other things, small details that I had previously overlooked or dismissed. The way my parents would stop talking abruptly when I entered a room. The way my brother seemed to carry some invisible weight on his shoulders that made him seem older than his years. The way my sister was kept almost obsessively sheltered from certain topics and conversations. There were phone calls that my father would take in his study with the door closed, conversations conducted in urgent, hushed tones that would end the moment he heard footsteps in the hallway. There were times when my mother would stare off into space with this expression of deep sadness, this haunted look that would vanish the instant she realized someone was watching. There were weekends when my father would disappear for hours without explanation, claiming work obligations that seemed to happen with increasing frequency. I started paying attention to the way my parents interacted when they thought no one was watching, and I noticed that the affection that seemed so genuine in public became strained and performative in private. They still held hands, but there was no warmth in it. They still kissed, but it was mechanical, obligatory. I noticed that my brother had started drinking. Not obviously, not in a way that raised alarms, but I would smell alcohol on his breath sometimes when he came home late, and I would see the way his hands shook in the mornings. I noticed that my sister had become increasingly anxious, that she had nightmares that made her cry out in her sleep, that she clung to my mother with a desperation that seemed excessive for a child her age. But every time I tried to ask questions, every time I tried to dig beneath the surface, I was met with deflection and dismissal. My concerns were brushed aside as teenage angst, as an overactive imagination, as stress from school. I was told I was too sensitive, too analytical, that I needed to stop looking for problems where none existed, and so I learned to doubt my own perceptions, to question my own instincts, to silence the voice inside me that kept insisting that something was fundamentally wrong with the picture my family was presenting to the world. The incident that ultimately led us to that courtroom happened on a night that started like any other. It was late spring, the air was warm and filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and I was home from college for the weekend. I had been studying at the local library and was walking back to my car when I saw my father's vehicle parked outside a restaurant downtown, which wasn't unusual, except that he had told my mother he was working late at the office. Something made me pause, some instinct that I had learned to trust after years of feeling like I was missing pieces of a puzzle, and I found myself walking toward the restaurant window. What I saw through that glass made my blood run cold. My father was sitting at a corner table with a woman I didn't recognize, a woman who was definitely not a work colleague based on the way he was holding her hand, based on the intimacy of their body language, based on the way he leaned in to kiss her when he thought no one was watching. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs, my mind racing to make sense of what I was witnessing. An affair, my father was having an affair, and suddenly so many things started clicking into place: the late nights, the distracted behavior, the distance between my parents that I had noticed but couldn't explain. I felt sick, physically ill, Betrayed not just on my own behalf but on my mother's, on behalf of the family unit that I had believed in with such blind faith. I didn't confront him that night. I couldn't. I was too shocked, too devastated. I just walked back to my car in a daze and drove home, where I found my mother in the kitchen making tea, humming to herself, completely unaware that her world was built on a foundation of lies. I wanted to tell her. I should have told her, but something stopped me. Maybe fear, maybe misguided loyalty to my father, maybe the childish hope that if I didn't speak it aloud, it wouldn't be real. Instead, I went to my room and cried silently into my pillow, mourning the death of my illusions, mourning the family I thought I had but apparently never did. The next few weeks were torture. I carried the weight of that secret like a physical burden, and it was eating me alive from the inside out. I couldn't look at my father without feeling a mixture of disgust and disappointment. I couldn't watch my mother's innocent trust without feeling guilty for not telling her the truth. I couldn't participate in our family dinners and game nights without feeling like the biggest hypocrite in the world. I started avoiding coming home, making excuses about schoolwork and social obligations, anything to not have to sit in that house and pretend everything was normal. But the universe has a way of forcing truth into the light, whether we're ready for it or not. It was my brother Marcus who ultimately set the chain of events in motion, though I didn't know it at the time. He had apparently been struggling with demons of his own, demons that I was only beginning to understand, and in a moment of desperate courage or desperate weakness, I'm still not sure which, he went to the police with information about our father. I didn't know what that information was. No one told me anything. All I knew was that suddenly there were police officers at our door, there was a warrant being served, there were questions being asked that made my mother's face go white with terror. My father was arrested right there in our living room with the family photos watching from the walls, with the throw pillows my mother had carefully arranged on the sofa, with everything that represented our normal life bearing witness to its destruction. The charges were serious: financial crimes, fraud, embezzlement from his firm, things I couldn't even fully comprehend in that moment because I was too busy trying to process the sight of my father in handcuffs, trying to understand how the man who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and told me he was proud of me could be a criminal. The investigation that followed ripped our family apart in ways I never could have imagined. Every aspect of our lives was scrutinized, examined, picked apart by strangers who didn't care about our pain or our dignity. Financial records were seized, computers were confiscated, interviews were conducted with everyone who had ever known us. The media got wind of the story, and suddenly our private tragedy was public entertainment. Our name was dragged through the mud. Neighbors who had once smiled and waved now crossed the street to avoid us. My mother was devastated, not just by my father's crimes, but by the revelation of his affair, which came out during the investigation like one more knife in her back. She moved through the house like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping, crying at random moments when she thought no one was watching. Emma became even more withdrawn, refusing to go to school because of the taunting and whispers from other kids, spending hours in her room with the door locked. Marcus, who had been the one to come forward, was treated like a traitor by some family members and a hero by others, and the pressure of that dichotomy seemed to be breaking him. And me, I was caught in the middle of it all, trying to be strong for everyone else while feeling like I was drowning, trying to make sense of how the life I had known and trusted had turned out to be nothing but an elaborate lie. I kept thinking about all those dinners, all those family vacations, all those moments of supposed happiness, and wondering how much of it had been real and how much had been performance. Had my father ever truly loved us? Or had we just been props in his carefully constructed facade? Had my mother known on some level and chosen to look the other way? Or had she been as deceived as the rest of us? These questions haunted me, kept me awake at night, followed me through my days like malevolent shadows. The trial was scheduled for early fall, and as the date approached, the tension in our family reached unbearable levels. We had meetings with lawyers, endless discussions about strategy and testimony, preparations for what we would say and how we would say it. My father pleaded not guilty, which meant we had to go through the whole ordeal of a trial instead of just accepting a plea deal and moving on. Part of me understood his reasoning. He wanted to fight. He wanted to prove that the charges were exaggerated or misunderstood. He wanted to salvage some shred of his reputation. But another part of me, the part that had seen him with that woman, the part that had watched my mother cry herself to sleep night after night, that part wanted him to just admit what he had done and face the consequences. We weren't required to attend the trial as a family, but my mother insisted. She said we needed to present a united front, that we needed to show the world that we stood by each other no matter what. I didn't have the heart to tell her that I didn't feel united, that I felt fractured and broken and unsure of who I was supposed to be in this new reality. So I agreed to go. And on that fateful Tuesday morning, I put on my best clothes, tried to make myself look presentable and composed, and rode to the courthouse with my family in a silence so thick it was suffocating. The courthouse was an imposing building, all concrete and glass and cold authority, and walking through those doors felt like entering some kind of alternate dimension where the rules of normal life no longer applied. We sat in the gallery, my mother on one side of me and Emma on the other, both of them rigid with tension, both of them staring straight ahead like they could will themselves through this ordeal through sheer force of determination. Marcus sat separately, as he was listed as a witness for the prosecution, and I could feel the weight of his absence, the physical manifestation of the divide that had opened up in our family. The trial proceedings were dry and technical, lawyers speaking in language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify, witnesses being called to testify about financial statements and business dealings that meant nothing to me. I found my attention drifting, found myself studying the other people in the courtroom, the judge with her severe expression and sharp eyes, the jury members trying to stay focused and attentive, the court reporter typing away with mechanical efficiency. Hours passed in this strange limbo, and I started to feel like maybe we would get through this. Maybe it would be painful but survivable. Maybe we could begin to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward. Then the prosecutor called a witness I hadn't expected, a colleague of my father's who had worked with him for over 15 years, someone I had met at company picnics and holiday parties, someone who had always seemed friendly and trustworthy. This man took the stand, was sworn in, and began to testify about discrepancies he had noticed in company accounts, about his concerns that he had brought to the board, about evidence he had gathered that pointed to systematic fraud over a period of years. It was damning testimony, detailed and specific, and I watched my father's face grow more and more strained as the witness spoke. But it was what came next that changed everything. The judge, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and glasses perched on the end of her nose, leaned forward and asked a question that seemed innocuous at first. She said, and I remember her exact words because they're burned into my memory forever, she said, "Mr. Harrison, in your testimony, you mentioned that the defendant often involved his family in company events and used his children's names for various accounts and transactions. Can you tell me, were the defendant's children aware that their identities were being used in this way?" The witness hesitated, glanced at my father, then said clearly, "Based on conversations I had with the defendant, Your Honor, at least one of his children was not only aware but actively participated in some of these transactions." The courtroom seemed to explode and freeze at the same time. I felt my mother's hand grip mine with bruising force, felt Emma go rigid beside me, heard gasps and whispers ripple through the gallery. But what I remember most, what will haunt me for the rest of my life, is the expression on my father's face when he looked back at us. It wasn't guilt or remorse or apology. It was calculation. It was the face of someone who had just been caught and was frantically trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. And then slowly, with a horror that felt like drowning in ice water, I watched as both my parents' eyes moved to Marcus, watched as understanding and accusation and betrayal flashed across their features. My brother, my golden, perfect older brother, who had always done everything right, who had been my father's pride and joy, had been involved in the fraud. He had known, he had participated, and his coming forward to the police hadn't been an act of conscience but an act of self-preservation, an attempt to secure immunity for himself by turning on my father. The judge asked for clarification, asked which child had been involved, and the witness said Marcus's name out loud in that courtroom for everyone to hear. And I felt my entire understanding of my family history rewrite itself in an instant. Have you ever had that experience where suddenly everything you thought you knew makes sense in a completely different and terrible way? All those private conversations between my father and Marcus, all that pressure and expectation that had been placed on him, all those times I had envied his closeness with our father. It had all been built on corruption and crime. But the revelations didn't stop there because my mother, who I had thought of as the innocent victim in all of this, who I had pitied and protected and worried about, my mother stood up in that courtroom and said in a voice that shook with emotion, That's not true. Marcus was protecting me. I was the one who helped my husband. I kept the second set of books. I facilitated the transfers. Marcus only found out because he saw documents in our home office, and he tried to stop us. The silence that followed was absolute, total, deafening. The judge called for order even though no one was making a sound. Everyone was too shocked, too stunned by what we were witnessing. My mother continued, tears streaming down her face, explaining that she had known about my father's fraud for years, that she had helped him hide it, that she had done it because they were in debt, because my father's affair had been costing money they didn't have, because she was terrified of losing the life we had built, the status we enjoyed, the respect of our community. She talked about how Marcus had discovered what they were doing and threatened to go to the authorities unless they stopped, about how they had promised him they would wind things down and make things right, but instead had continued and even escalated. She talked about how Marcus had finally gone to the police not to betray them, but because he felt he had no other choice, because the fraud had grown too large, because other people were starting to notice. Emma was crying beside me, her whole body shaking with sobs, and I put my arm around her even though I was falling apart myself, even though I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was hearing. The mother I had loved and trusted, who had taught me about honesty and integrity, who had been my moral compass my entire life, had been complicit in crimes that had hurt innocent people, had destroyed lives and livelihoods, all to maintain an illusion of success and happiness. The judge called a recess, and we were ushered out of the courtroom into a small conference room where a victim advocate tried to explain what would happen next, tried to offer comfort and resources, but I couldn't hear her words over the roaring in my ears. I looked at my mother, really looked at her for the first time in my life, and saw a stranger, someone I didn't know and wasn't sure I wanted to know. I looked at Emma, who was only 17 and had just learned that both of her parents were criminals, that her brother had been caught up in their schemes, that everything she had believed about her family was a lie. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't have any comfort to offer. I was drowning in my own pain and confusion and anger. Marcus was brought in to talk to us, accompanied by his lawyer, and the look on his face was one of profound relief mixed with profound guilt. He tried to explain, tried to justify his decisions, tried to make us understand the impossible position he had been in, but I couldn't listen. I was too overwhelmed by the avalanche of revelations that just kept coming. My father had been having an affair. My mother had been complicit in his crimes. My brother had been caught in the middle and forced to make impossible choices, and I had been completely blind to all of it, living in a fantasy world while my family rotted from the inside. The perfect life I had believed in, the ideal family I had been so proud of, had never existed at all. It had been a carefully staged production, and I had been the only one who didn't know I was part of a show. The aftermath of that day was chaos, pure and absolute chaos. My mother was arrested, charged as an accessory to my father's crimes, and the two of them were held pending further hearings. Marcus was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, but the price of that immunity was his relationships with our parents, who felt utterly betrayed by his cooperation with authorities, even though his alternative had been prison. Emma and I were suddenly on our own, two young adults trying to figure out how to survive in the wreckage of our imploded family. The house we had grown up in was seized as part of the asset forfeiture process, along with our cars, our savings, everything our parents had accumulated through their illegal activities. We moved into a small apartment together, pooling what little money we had from our own jobs and savings, trying to figure out how to pay for basic necessities while also dealing with the emotional devastation of what we had learned. Extended family members reached out, some offering support, others offering judgment and criticism, most wanting to distance themselves from the scandal that had engulfed our name. I had to take a leave of absence from college because I couldn't afford tuition anymore and couldn't focus on studying anyway. My mind was too fractured, too consumed with trying to understand how I had missed all the signs, how I had been so naive and trusting. Emma dropped out of high school temporarily, unable to face the gossip and stares of her classmates, unable to pretend that she was okay when she so clearly wasn't. We spent our days in a fog of grief and anger, sometimes talking for hours about our feelings and memories, sometimes sitting in silence because there were no words adequate to express what we were experiencing. I found myself obsessively reviewing my childhood, analyzing every memory through this new lens of knowledge, seeing deception and manipulation in moments I had once cherished as genuine connection. Every holiday, every birthday, every family milestone was now tainted by the knowledge that it had all been funded by stolen money, built on lies, performed for an audience that included us children who had no idea we were being deceived. Therapy became essential for both Emma and me, individually and together, as we tried to process the trauma of what we had experienced. My therapist helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for my parents' choices, that I couldn't have known what I wasn't told, that being trusting and believing the best of people wasn't a character flaw, but knowing those things intellectually didn't make the pain go away, didn't heal the deep wounds of betrayal and disillusionment. Emma struggled even more than I did, her sense of identity completely shattered, her ability to trust anyone, including me, severely damaged. She had nightmares constantly, panic attacks that would leave her gasping for breath and sobbing uncontrollably, moments of dissociation where she would seem to disconnect from reality entirely. I did my best to be there for her, to provide stability and support, but I was barely holding myself together, barely surviving each day. Marcus tried to maintain contact with us, but it was difficult. Our relationship was complicated by what had happened, by the secrets he had kept, by his role in exposing our parents, even though he had done the right thing. Part of me was grateful to him for being brave enough to stop the fraud, for choosing integrity over loyalty to corrupt parents. But another part of me resented him for shattering our illusions, for forcing us to face truths we weren't ready to confront. Our parents both eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received prison sentences, my father for 5 years and my mother for 3, and we had to decide whether we wanted to maintain relationships with them or cut them off completely. Emma refused all contact, unable and unwilling to forgive, but I found myself going to visit them occasionally, driven by some complicated mix of duty and curiosity and unresolved emotions. Those visits were painful and strange, sitting across from people who looked like my parents but felt like strangers, listening to their explanations and justifications and apologies that never quite felt adequate or sincere. Slowly, painfully, over months and then years, Emma and I began to rebuild our lives from the ruins of our family. We learned to trust again, cautiously and selectively, building friendships with people who proved through consistent action that they were worthy of that trust. We went back to school, Emma eventually getting her GED and starting community college, me returning to finish my degree with the help of financial aid and part-time jobs. We created new traditions and new memories that weren't tainted by our parents' crimes, celebrating holidays in our own way, marking milestones without the shadow of our past hanging over us. We learned that family isn't just about blood and biology. It's about choice and commitment and showing up for each other even when things are hard. We learned that perfection is an illusion, and that real love, real connection requires honesty and vulnerability, and the courage to be flawed and imperfect together. We learned that we were stronger than we had ever imagined, more resilient, more capable of surviving and even thriving in circumstances that should have destroyed us. The journey wasn't linear. There were setbacks and bad days, moments when the pain felt overwhelming and the future felt impossible. But we kept moving forward because that was the only option, because staying stuck in bitterness and anger and grief would have meant letting our parents' choices destroy our lives too. I began to understand that I could acknowledge the pain of what had happened, while also refusing to let it define me, that I could grieve the family I had lost while also building something new and hopefully healthier for myself. I learned to separate my parents' actions from my own worth, to recognize that their crimes and lies said nothing about my value as a person, to stop carrying shame that wasn't mine to carry. Now, several years removed from that day in the courtroom, I can look back on what happened with a perspective that I couldn't access when I was in the middle of the trauma. I understand now that the judge's question wasn't what destroyed my family. My family was already destroyed, already built on a foundation of lies and secrets that was always going to collapse eventually. That question just forced us to confront the truth that we had been avoiding, that we had been complicit in avoiding even when signs were there. I understand that my parents' choices came from their own fears and insecurities and moral failings, that they prioritized comfort and status over integrity, that they convinced themselves that the ends justified the means until they were in so deep they couldn't see a way out. I understand that Marcus was put in an impossible situation and made the best choice he could under terrible circumstances, that choosing to expose wrongdoing even when it hurts people you love is one of the hardest and bravest things a person can do. I understand that Emma and I are not victims in the sense of being helpless or defined by what happened to us. We're survivors who have every right to be angry and hurt, but also every right to heal and move forward and create lives that reflect our values, rather than our trauma. The experience changed me fundamentally, made me more cautious and less trusting in some ways, but also more compassionate and more aware of the complexity of human nature in other ways. I know now that people are capable of both tremendous love and tremendous harm, sometimes toward the same people, sometimes simultaneously. I know that everyone is fighting battles we can't see, carrying secrets that shape their behavior in ways we don't understand. I know that judgment should be tempered with empathy even when people have made terrible choices, because those choices always come from somewhere, from pain or fear or desperation that we might not comprehend. If I could go back and tell my younger self anything, I would say this: trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it probably is, and you shouldn't let anyone convince you to doubt your own perceptions. I would say, perfection is always a red flag. Real families are messy and imperfect and openly struggle sometimes, and that's actually healthier than the facade of flawlessness. I would say, you are not responsible for your parents' choices or for keeping their secrets. You deserve to live in truth even when truth is painful. I would say, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel betrayed. It's okay to mourn the loss of what you thought you had. All of those feelings are valid and necessary parts of healing. Most importantly, I would say, you will survive this. You will rebuild. You will discover strength and resilience you didn't know you possessed. And you will eventually find peace and even happiness again, even though that seems impossible right now. The road will be long and difficult and full of setbacks, but you will walk it, one step at a time, and you will emerge on the other side as someone wiser and stronger and more authentically yourself than you were before. To everyone watching this video, I want you to know that if you've experienced betrayal or disillusionment in your family, if you've discovered that people you trusted weren't who you thought they were, you are not alone. So many of us are walking around carrying these hidden wounds, these private griefs that we don't talk about, because we're ashamed, or because we think no one else will understand. But the truth is that family trauma is far more common than we acknowledge, and there is no shame in having been deceived by people you loved. There is only courage in choosing to face the truth and heal from it. I'm sharing my story not because I want sympathy or attention, but because I believe that speaking our truths, especially the painful and uncomfortable ones, is how we break the cycles of secrecy and shame that allow dysfunction to continue across generations. I want to be the person I needed when I was sitting in that courtroom watching my world collapse. I want to be the voice that says it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be angry at your parents. It's okay to grieve a family that never really existed except in your imagination. Have you experienced something similar in your own family? Have you discovered secrets that changed how you understood your past? I really want to hear your stories in the comments below, because sharing our experiences is how we realize we're not alone, how we build community and support with others who understand what we've been through. Please take a moment to leave a comment about your own journey with family betrayal, or about what this story brought up for you, because your voice matters, and your experience matters, and someone else reading might need to hear exactly what you have to say. I also want to emphasize how important it is to really understand and process these kinds of experiences, rather than just pushing them down and pretending everything is fine. Denial and avoidance might provide temporary relief, but they prevent real healing. They keep us stuck in patterns that don't serve us. They rob us of the opportunity to grow and change, and become more integrated versions of ourselves. This content, these stories about real human experiences and real struggles, they matter because they help us make sense of our own lives. They provide mirrors in which we can see our own pain reflected and validated. They offer hope that healing is possible even after devastating betrayal. So please, if this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your heart, or made you think about your own family dynamics in a new way, leave a like on this video to show your support and to help this message reach more people who might need to hear it. The algorithm favors videos with high engagement, so your like actually helps others find this content when they're searching for understanding and connection. It's a small action that has real impact. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, more honest and raw accounts of real people dealing with real struggles, Please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales right now by clicking that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic human experiences without sugarcoating or judgment, to creating a space where people can come to feel less alone in their pain and more empowered in their healing. We cover all kinds of stories about family dysfunction, betrayal, trauma recovery, and personal growth, all told from a place of honesty and vulnerability that I believe is so desperately needed in our world of curated social media perfection. When you subscribe, you're joining a community of people committed to truth-telling and healing, people who understand that real life is complicated and painful and beautiful all at once, people who refuse to pretend everything is fine when it's not. Make sure to hit that notification bell too so you never miss a new story, because we post regularly, and each story has the potential to provide exactly the perspective or validation or inspiration you need in that moment. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, for being part of this community, for having the courage to engage with difficult and uncomfortable truths. I know these stories aren't easy to hear. They bring up our own pain and our own unresolved issues, but that's exactly why they're important. Because growth happens in discomfort. Healing happens when we stop avoiding and start facing what hurts. Remember that your story matters too. Whatever you've been through, whatever secrets you've carried, whatever betrayals you've endured, they're valid, and they deserve to be acknowledged and processed. You deserve support and understanding and the opportunity to heal, not just to survive but to truly thrive beyond your trauma. Keep coming back to this channel for more stories that will challenge you and comfort you and remind you that you're never alone in your struggles, and please keep engaging in the comments because that's how we build the kind of community that actually makes a difference in people's lives. Until next time, take care of yourselves, be gentle with your healing journey, and remember that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than beautiful lies.